Hello, hello. You're listening to the Bitcoin Advocate podcast. I'm your host, Andy. And if you're new here, welcome. This is the show where we discuss all things Bitcoin on a weekly basis. This is the show that I wish I had when I first got into Bitcoin, which is why I made this show. This is meant to be your one-stop shop of complex topics in the wonderful world of Bitcoin, explained in simple ways. As a reminder, this show is available on YouTube, Spotify, Amazon Music, and a whole bunch of other platforms. So wherever you might be listening from, if you like the show, be sure to follow and subscribe. You can also follow the show on Twitter at twitter.com/thebtcadvocate. And if there are any graphics that I want to show you, it will be posted there. All right, so without further ado, let's jump in. Today's story begins in 1944 in a previously little-known ski resort called Bretton Woods, located against the backdrop of the Appalachian Mountains in New Hampshire. It was here that delegates from 44 nations met to create a monetary system that would lead the world out of the ashes of World War II. Because you see, during the war, all the Allied countries in Europe had frantically been shipping a large amount of gold to the United States for safekeeping should their country be conquered by Nazi Germany. But by 1944, the war had decisively turned in the favor of the Allies. The Germans were bogged down and completely stalled out by the Russians in the east. The agreement that ended up being signed at Bretton Woods was aptly named the Bretton Woods Agreement, which would establish the US dollar as the global reserve currency. The US dollar would be pegged to gold, and other countries' currencies would be pegged to the US dollar. With this agreement, the US was clearly in a strong position since it now possessed approximately two-thirds of the entire world's supply of gold, and it's easy to see why this was beneficial for the US. Since the world was now dependent on the US dollar, and the US dollar was the only currency that bore a direct connection to the real money, which was gold. And I think that this quote from American economist Barry Eichengreen summarizes the situation the best. So he said, "It only costs a few cents for the Bureau of Engraving and Printing to produce a $100 bill, but other countries had to pony up $100 worth of actual goods in order to obtain one." So we talked about something similar in the episode last week when we discussed the axiom of money. So in case you forgot, here's maybe a 20 to 60 second summary. So I was discussing the difference between getting paid in gold versus getting paid in dollars. The idea is that if you're getting paid in gold, somebody had to dig that gold up from the ground, refine it, and cast it into a gold bar or a coin. And all of that requires work. Gold is scarce as well, so it's very difficult to find enough of it to make a coin in the first place. Versus getting paid in dollars, as I'm sure most of us do, the government can just create it out of thin air. So this creates a fundamental imbalance because you're giving up something valuable, which is your labor, in exchange for something that was created out of thin air with no effort. So this is the exact same situation that other countries found themselves in the wake of Bretton Woods in the decades that followed the Bretton Woods Agreement. It became clear to the other countries that at some point in time, the US was printing more money than the gold that was needed to back it. So as much gold as the US possessed, it did not possess enough to back the dollars that were in circulation, meaning that they had printed more money than the gold that they had. And when other countries realized this, they began to redeem their US dollar reserves for gold. So think of this as a bank run, but on an international scale, because up to this point, the US dollar was supposed to be backed by gold. And when people no longer believed that to be the case, then all hell broke loose. So by 1965, this bank run had escalated so much that the then president of France and famous war hero Charles de Gaulle sailed his fleet across the Atlantic Ocean and politely asked, and by politely asked, I mean mildly threatened, the US redeem the US dollars that he had for gold. Clearly, the system, as you can see, was becoming unsustainable. And sure enough, in 1971, in a now infamous 18-minute speech, then US President Richard Nixon announced the temporary suspension of convertibility between US dollar and gold. So in other words, you can no longer redeem your dollars for gold. Of course, whenever the government says something is temporary, it's never temporary. It became permanent, and from that point onwards, the US dollar's relationship to gold was completely severed. So this is the point where you could say that the US dollar became fully fiat. So recall from last episode what fiat means. So fiat is a Latin word that means something along the lines of let it be done. And fiat money is only valuable because the government says is valuable. So in other words, the government prints it and says, let it be that this piece of paper is worth something rather than nothing. And we all have to believe it. Now, I should note that even before 1971, if you're a private citizen, the private citizen's ability to redeem their dollars for gold was already gone, meaning that in the decades before 1971, you couldn't just take cash to a bank and be like, hey, I want the equivalent value in gold. However, the US dollar up until that point was still nominally and theoretically tied to gold when it came to dealings between central banks and other countries. So when that announcement came in 1971 that the US dollar was no longer tied to gold, as the average citizen, you probably did not understand it nor fully appreciate the significance of it. But I can assure you that the significance of this was profound. Now, here is where I'll try to rely on some graphics, which I've posted to Twitter. So these graphics were not made by me, but by a website called WTFHappened1971.com. And I highly recommend you check out the website if you have time. However, if you're listening in the background and not in a position to look at anything, let me try to describe things verbally. So the first is a line graph that has two lines, one for compensation, i.e. workers' wages, and another for line for productivity, measured from 1948 to 2017. So it's over decades and decades, over a long period of time. In the period of time between 1948 and 1972, you can see the two lines basically are the same. They overlap each other. They almost perfectly overlap each other and they're parallel, which shows that in that time period, wages and productivities increased in lockstep. In simpler terms, if the company you work for grew, your wages also went up in accordance. In fact, the two lines meet each other in 1972, meaning that between 1948 and 1972, both wages and productivity had gone up 90.84%. However, in the period between 1972 and 2017, the two lines began to diverge. So between 1972 and 2017, wages went up 115%, while productivity went up 246%. In other words, the total amounts of goods and services in society went up dramatically, but this time the workers' wages did not go up in accordance. So the value that was generated in society due to increased productivity did not get reflected in wages. So where did the value go, though, if not into workers' wages? Well, I keep on hammering the same point, but you have to ask yourself, could this have something to do with the fact that after 1971, the workers' wages were made in a currency that the government can create out of thin air? So think about that question as we move along. Now, next, I want to show you a chart of the price of everyday goods in 1971, or just generally the cost of living. A new house in 1971 was $25,200. These are in US dollars. And the average income was $10,622 per year. A new car costs around $3,500. Average rent was about $150 per month. Tuition to Harvard University was $2,600 per year. A movie ticket is $1.50. Gasoline is 40 cents per gallon. And a United States postage stamp is 8 cents. When it comes to food, granulated sugar, 62 cents for 5 pounds. Vitamin D milk, $1.17 per gallon. Ground coffee, 98 cents per pound. Bacon, 80 cents per pound. Eggs, 45 cents per dozen. Fresh ground hamburger, 62 cents per pound. And fresh baked bread is 25 cents per loaf. So as you can see, the dollar doesn't buy you what it used to. And as you guessed it, the reason is inflation. Now, I know that inflation is a big topic again recently, so how does inflation relate to all of what we just talked about today? Well, you see, a country is just a way that people organize themselves, and it shares a lot of similarities with other organizations like a family. Now, imagine if your family, if you were the manager of finances for your family and you had some debts and bills that you really needed to pay. Now, if you're just an average citizen, your choices would be either to try and cut your spending or make more money that month, which would be hard, right? Or alternatively, in the worst case scenario, you'd have to default on the debt. But this is where the similarities between you and the government end. So the government actually has an alternative solution. The government can just print more money and use that to pay off the debt. So notice that this is only possible if the money was fiat, right? So if it was backed by gold, like it was before, then they would have to produce an equivalent amount of gold to back the dollars needed to pay off the debt, which would be really hard to do because, you need actual work to produce more gold. Now, let's pause on this for a second. You're telling me that if I was the government, there's a solution to my debt problems that doesn't involve cutting spending, nor making more money, which is hard, and I don't default on my debt either. So yeah, exactly. And let me rephrase this, okay? So pretend you're an average citizen again, and I gave you a money printer that you can use to get rid of all your debt and buy whatever you want. How much would you use that money printer? So I imagine that you would go crazy with it, right? And why would you think that the government would act any differently? They don't. They go crazy with the money printer. So when you print money, though, it causes inflation. So imagine you're on this island, right? So let me give you a thought experiment to make this more concrete. So imagine you're on an island and there's only two things on this island, dollars and coconuts. So everyone only uses their dollars to buy coconuts. Now imagine there's 100 people and they each have $1 and there's 100 coconuts. So each coconut would be $1, right? Now I show up and I print money out of thin air and I give each person a $100 bill. So everybody just has 100x whatever money they had before, but there's still only 100 coconuts. So what do you think happens to the price of each coconut? Well, then the price just goes through the roof. So what I'm trying to say is that people hyper focus on the number of dollars, but what you really should care about is how much each dollar buys you. It's only the purchasing power of money that you care about. So the number of dollars is just a number. So put it this way, right? Let me give you another example. So if I offered you a job that gave you 100% annual wage increase, would you take that job? Of course you would, right? That sounds like a sweet deal. But what if in the fine print, I said that you had to take all your pay in Venezuelan bolivars? This means that, let's say this year you make 100,000 bolivars and next year I'll double it to 200,000 bolivars and the year after that will be 400,000 bolivars per year. So for reference, at the time of this podcast, $1 is worth about 1.7 million bolivars. So around this time, 10 years ago, though, $1 was worth about 4 bolivars. So if you had your wealth stored in bolivars, it wouldn't have even mattered if your salary doubled every year. And the government is not immune to the same human emotions as the rest of us, right? So in fact, when you mix power into the decision-making process, you'll find that it often exacerbates vices like greed and laziness. So when they have a money printer, it's really easy for them just to crank it, right? It's an easy solution that kicks a can down the road and they don't have to cut any spending and they don't have to default on current debts. So why change anything? So the government always has an incentive to print money and cause inflation. And that's just a consequence of our fiat system. And inflation actually benefits the rich if we really think about what inflation is, right? So inflation is a general rise of the prices of assets and goods and services. So the rich own more assets like real estate, stocks, and other investments, which rise along with inflation. Now, if you're poor, then you most likely have most of your wealth in cash because you need to spend it to live. And you don't have the opportunity to convert any of your cash to assets. So inflation means that your cash goes less and less distance every year, and you don't get to enjoy the rising prices of assets, while the opposite is true for the rich. So back to the chart about wages versus productivity. So if productivity had gone up so much and the wages have not followed, then where did the value go? So the answer is that it went into the assets that were owned by the rich, that are owned by the rich. In other words, it was stolen out from the worker's pocket through the mechanism of inflation by method of cranking the money printer. Okay, so right now I've spent a lot of time talking about economics and first principles, and at this point you might be wondering, is this still a show about Bitcoin? Right? So I've spent 2 episodes talking about just random economic stuff or seemingly random economic stuff. I promise I'm getting to talking about Bitcoin, but I think it's very important that we understand the full extent of the problem that Bitcoin is trying to solve. I think it's super important that we understand the gravity of the situation. Now, I think a lot of people misunderstand Bitcoin when they first see it because they don't understand the deeper meaning of it, right? So they just call it internet gambling money that's used for speculation without understanding the goals that it's trying to achieve. So the goal of these first few episodes is to talk about the first principles of economics, which is why next episode we will talk about gold and its role in the history of money, and in the end tie it all back to Bitcoin. So for now, I'll leave the episode here for today. And thank you all for listening. I'll see you guys next week.